This is the main synagogue in Cairo in the medieval period that was used by Rabbinite Jews, so like the mainstream strain of Judaism that's still around today. And their Geniza was a hidden chamber that didn't have any doors or windows. The only way to get to it was to climb up the stairs inside the synagogue to the second floor women's gallery, which is where women would attend synagogue, and men would be on the ground floor. At the back of that gallery, there was a hole in the wall about 8 or 10 feet up. You needed a ladder to reach it. And inside that hole was the Geniza chamber, which is about the size of a medium-sized room. And when things needed to go in, you would go to that hole and just put it up through the wall, and it would never be seen again. The expectation was that it would go in there and no one would ever see it again.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Nick Posegay. He is co-author of the illustrated Cairo Genizah. I'm not going to bother trying to explain what that is here, because if you keep listening, you're going to hear an explanation of what that is. But the book that we're discussing does come out tomorrow. There are links in the show notes for pre-order. If you're listening to this the day before, the day the episode is released, it'll be out tomorrow. Anytime after that, you could acquire this book through the publisher, through whatever bookseller you'd like. But it's a beautiful book, just from what I've seen from the review copy that I received in PDF form. There's a lot of really interesting features that they add to kind of help non-experts understand how they go through these fragments, these texts, and how they derive the content, the meaning, what its significance is for producing new historiography, new understandings of this, I think, roughly 1,000-year period. And so in the 100 plus years since this discovery was made, this has helped move things down the field in biblical studies and in historical studies around Judaism of medieval era. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Nick Posegay. Nick Posegay, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Jared.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Right. Well, I'm Nick Posegay. I have a PhD from the University of Cambridge in Middle Eastern Studies. Currently, I'm working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Cambridge Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, where I'm studying interfaith exchange in the intellectual history of the Middle East, specifically the medieval period, so between about the 8th and 11th centuries CE. And my research focuses on the exchange of ideas between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities in that period.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. So the topic of our conversation is going to be your forthcoming book, The Illustrated Cairo Genizah. It's not out yet, right?
Right. So this new book that I've written with one of my colleagues, Dr. Melanie Schmier-Lee, is called The Illustrated Cairo Genizah, and you're right, Jared, it's not out quite yet. I think besides the authors, you are one of the only people in the world who has even seen it. So you have a better idea than most, but it is a book focused on the Cairo Genizah, and it is a product of the Geniza Research Unit at the Cambridge University Library. And we've written this book to celebrate 50 years since the founding of the Geniza Research Unit in 1974. And it is meant to be a book that gives a diverse range of all the different manuscripts that are in the Cairo Genizah collections at the Cambridge University Library. And I can already anticipate the follow-up question, which is, what is the Cairo Genizah? So part of our work at the Cambridge University Library is dealing with manuscripts from what's called the Cairo Genizah, which is a Jewish collection of texts. And the easiest way to explain it is by starting with the question, what is a Geniza? So the word Geniza is Hebrew, and it means a hiding place or storing place. And it refers to a hidden space, usually in a synagogue, something like a hidden room or a cupboard, where Jewish communities deposit manuscripts, so handwritten texts, but also books, anything that is written that contains the name of God in Hebrew, because those items are considered sacred and can't just be thrown away like regular trash. Instead, they're kept safe in a Geniza until rabbis or members of the community can give them a proper burial in a more respectful manner. Um, what's unique about the Cairo Genizah, and that is the term we use for a collection of Genizahs centered around the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Old Cairo, um, which operated from about the 11th century up to the 20th century. And the Jews of Cairo deposited things in there for almost 1,000 years without ever emptying it out. It was a hidden room inside their synagogue. And at the end of the 19th century, British scholars mainly went to Cairo and acquired it and brought the majority of the manuscripts that were in it to Cambridge University Library. And we've been studying it ever since.
So, what kinds of things are we talking about being in this collection? Is it just everyday documents, or are these things that are very theologically significant or religiously significant as documents or fragments go?
This is what makes the Cairo Genizah so unique, is that Uh, well, the first thing is that almost by definition, anything that ends up in a Geniza is too old or damaged for continued use. So there are a lot of fragments of books, fragments of individual pages, when we don't have the whole book. So we have to piece them together um, from bits of text that can't always be recognized on their own until you find the pieces that join with them. The other thing that so besides just being thrown away, the other thing is that anything with the name of God on it is considered sacred, but not everything sacred has the name of God. Not only sacred things get the name of God on it. So in the medieval period, when you were writing a letter in Arabic or Hebrew, it would be very common to use turns of phrase that include the name of God, or even to just start the letter out saying, may God protect whoever is receiving this, or in the name of God, and then you would continue writing. So those things qualify for storage in a Geniza, but the contents of them could just be a love letter. We have letters from husbands and wives who are no longer living together because the husband usually has gone off on business, and that takes a year or more to travel to India and buy goods and then travel all the way back to Cairo. So they'll send letters back and forth, and they're talking about each other or their families, but they're not talking about anything particularly sacred. And yet this is stored in the Cairo Genizah. And for 1,000 years, it was never emptied out. So we have shopping lists and kids writing exercises from their schoolwork and recipe books and all sorts of things that you wouldn't expect to find, at least in a modern Geniza, um, which we mainly expect to find Bibles, prayer texts, things like that. Those are also in the Cairo Genizah, but it's the whole range of genres that the Jews of Cairo had access to in the medieval period.
Okay, so there's a lot into their private lives that people are just voluntarily. I mean, would it be safe to say that it's voluntarily submitting to a communal archive?
Not exactly. They are voluntarily submitting them. They're voluntarily putting things. Um, I can put it in a little more perspective for the Ben Ezra Synagogue in particular. This is the main synagogue in Cairo in the medieval period that was used by Rabbinite Jews, so like the mainstream strain of Judaism that's still around today. And their Geniza was a hidden chamber that didn't have any doors or windows. The only way to get to it was to climb up the stairs inside the synagogue to the second floor women's gallery, which is where women would attend synagogue, and men would be on the ground floor. At the back of that gallery, there was a hole in the wall about 8 or 10 feet up. You needed a ladder to reach it, and inside that hole was the Geniza chamber, which is about the size of a medium-sized room. And when things needed to go in, you would go to that hole and just put it up through the wall, and it would never be seen again. The expectation was that it would go in there and no one would ever see it again. It wasn't an archive that was organized like a library or anything. Once it was in there, It was considered too old or not worth keeping around. And it was meant to protect it so it wouldn't be profaned, because of course it has the name of God, or even just Hebrew script was sometimes enough to be considered sacred enough to go into a Geniza. So there's never any expectation that it will be read again, and it's only when we've started doing research on it since the end of the 19th century that all of these really personal documents, in addition to very sacred books, there's ancient Bibles in there as well, have all come out. And you're absolutely right, though. Like, people will share private information about um, their relationships, about their family members, their like concerns for like their children. But there's one really nice letter that's actually in the book about a guy who's gone away on business, and he's writing home frantic because he keeps worrying about the roof tiles falling off his house and hitting his toddler in the head. And he's so worried about the kids who are super young, and he can't stand to be away from them. Um, so there's that, and then on the other end, there's like really official letters. So from famous people like Moses Maimonides, who was the head of the Jewish community in the 12th century, he writes letters trying to get like hostages back from Crusader armies, and he's trying to raise money so they can pay to get things that were taken from Jerusalem back into the Jewish community, or trying to secure shipments between traders that are going to Spain and India. And so it's any genre you can think of, it's in there.
So I kind of want to shift to the documents themselves because that is so. This is to illustrate their representations of whole documents or fragments, and then a lot there'll be stories, background information. This is a very interesting book, and the intent of the book is for it to be a coffee table book. It's a beautiful book, even in the PDF format.
Yeah, it's meant to be nice to look at, just sort of as an artistic piece, because every manuscript, unlike books today, which every copy is more or less exactly the same because they're from a printing press. Every manuscript is unique in its own way, even if they say similar things. So every little fragment is, in a way, its own artistic piece. You have the handwriting of an individual scribe, or even a person who wasn't a scribe but writing. There's also some that are illustrated themselves, and we want it to be sort of a display book that you would have on coffee table. That's nice just to look at, but also every fragment has its own story attached to it that we've written based on historical context and research. So if you're more interested in the historical side than the artistic side, there's a lot for you here.
So I know this does a really good job of exposing something that I wasn't aware of until I started doing the podcast and doing research for the podcast, and that is, as you say, an individual scribe, like an individual's handwriting. Scribes, they put some of themselves into the work, so they were making an individual contribution. But I think the wider net that text critics or philologists have to deal with is, whether it's an archaeological dig or in this case the discovery of this Geniza, it's what you get. You have to make the most of it, and you guys are both displaying collection or collect these collections. I guess I should say how have they helped in the development of techniques and understanding and skill for what you do.
That is a really good question, and there's a couple ways to go with it. Certainly, we have developed a somewhat independent field that is referred to as Geniza Studies, and it overlaps a lot with Jewish history, Islamic history, the history of Arabic and Hebrew, and the medieval Mediterranean world more broadly. But there is a certain niche for scholars who work specifically with Cairo Genizah documents, because as far as we know, it's hard to get an exact count, but there's somewhere between 300 and 400,000 Geniza fragments in the world. And about two-thirds of them are in Cambridge, and the rest are in other collections in Oxford, the British Library, Manchester, and there's some in the Russian National Library. Those are like the main big collections. and the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. So that's where the Princeton Geniza lab is based. Um, so the all of these institutions that have Geniza collections have developed this sort of field of Geniza studies where working on decipherment of very damaged texts and reconstructing texts from fragments that may be stored in libraries on different continents, and sharing expertise about um, like what we expect to see in the Geniza and then what is unique and strange to find. So we expect to find certain things in a certain Jewish context, of course. We expect to find Hebrew Bibles, and we do. But then when you find things like Islamic government manuscripts, documents from the Mamluks or the Fatimid caliphates that are also in the Cairo Genizah, that raises questions, and people start looking into that. Or as something that I've researched in the last few years is Quran manuscripts, so the Holy Book of Islam. There's fragments of it in the Geniza. Why would that be? And the Geniza gives us this very interesting context because we know the final context for the most part for most manuscripts. They ended up in Cairo at the end of their life, and they were put here in this synagogue. So whenever we're working with a manuscript, we have to explain how it got there, and that's sort of the key value of the Cairo Genizah because it gives us so much context, but also makes it difficult to explain some things. I hope that answered the question.
Well, I mean, it certainly got us going in a direction. So let's kind of camp out there on other religious texts or sacred texts. Why would there be a Quran in there?
Well, there's a couple of reasons that I've written some papers about this with one of my other colleagues, Dr. Magdalene Connolly, and we did a survey of all the Geniza fragments in Cambridge, which is it's about 200,000 fragments, and we definitely missed some, but we found as many as we could. Fragments that are specifically from the Quran or fragments that are just containing Quranic text. And we found about 35 fragments, which isn't a lot in the whole scheme of the Geniza, but it is a lot more than you would expect to find in the synagogue. Um, so, one of the explanations um, is that Jews in the medieval period were very concerned with arguing against Islam, and arguing against other religions that might try to convert people from Judaism. Um, we know that people did convert from Judaism to Islam sometimes, as well as people converting from Christianity to Islam. And there are also people who reverted, so they would convert and then they decided, that's not for me. Um, and the Jews of Cairo, in particular, were concerned that the Rabbinite Jews were concerned that Karaite Jews, which was sort of the rival sect of Judaism at the time, would convert people to their sect of Judaism. But for people who were worried about Jews converting to Islam, they would argue polemically against Islam. So they would have to learn things about Islam in order to sort of debunk it, and then try to argue that Judaism is better and you shouldn't convert. So we call that polemics. Um, so having parts of the Quran or other Islamic texts, hadith, which is the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that were copied down over time, that could be useful if you were Jewish and you wanted to try and find perceived flaws in arguments for Islam. And we think that that's why some of the Islamic texts are ended up in the Geniza because, for example, if someone had a large personal library, a Jewish person had a large personal library in Cairo, and then they died or they moved away and they left their books behind, their family members may not have looked too closely at exactly what all the stuff they had was and just threw it all into the Geniza. And it may have been mostly Jewish books, but they may have had bits of Quran or other Islamic texts that they had been reading for polemical purposes. It's also, I always say, it's not out of the realm of possibility that someone was just interested in Islam or just interested in Christianity. There's also Christian texts in here. And Jews were just reading about them because they were curious. Maybe they were considering converting. Um, but whatever it is, they for some people for some of the time in the Geniza period, it seems that they just threw anything that was written into the Geniza chamber. So some of these Islamic fragments were among them.
So better safe than sorry. We're cleaning out Grandpa's library, and we just got to throw it all out because we don't want to miss something that needs to be in there.
So, yep, that's one thing. There's also the question of whether or not the name of God in Arabic would be considered holy enough to put into a Geniza.
So that's what I was wondering. Is there any indication that that's the case, or is it still an open question?
It's still an open question. We don't really have enough data because there's not enough Quran fragments to really tell, because we know where they were and that they ended up in this synagogue for the most part in the medieval period, but we don't know exactly who was using them, because that there's actually another reason why Islamic or Christian material might end up in the Geniza, and that is recycling. Because paper and especially parchment were very expensive. So in the medieval period, it was common to recycle old books or old manuscripts. So you'll often find in the Geniza, an official Islamic document from the Mamluk Caliphate. There's one that is from a court case that was presented before the Sultan Saladin, Salah ad-Din Saladin from the Crusades. And he was ruling in Egypt, and someone came before him, presented a court case. He ruled on the case, and they wrote out the ruling on the petition that had come to Saladin, and then they threw it away. And then this paper was it was recycled by the Jewish community because there was a lot of empty space on it, and they used it to write notes in Hebrew. So then that has to go into the Geniza, and indeed it has. But it still has the original text where Saladin is ruling on this court case about taxes. Um, so that's one way that paper would be recycled, and sometimes even sold as waste paper to then be rewritten. And the other way is for bookbinding, because parchment especially is really durable. So you can actually take a well, bookbinders would take used manuscripts, single leaves from manuscripts, and sew them onto the covers of books to protect the cover. Like it's very similar to leather, so it becomes the outer binding of a book, and that could be recycled fairly easily. And it's something that we can detect because you can see the holes around the edge of the manuscript where it's been sewn on. And then once that book fell apart, all the pieces were going in the Geniza, whether or not um, the person who owned it knew what the original material used to make the binding was. So there's a couple Quran fragments that were definitely used to rebind new books.
Okay. And then palimpsests. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, that's a little bit of a different phenomenon, but yes,
So what is that then? Do you mind explaining?
right. So a palimpsest it comes from a Greek word that means to be scratched or rubbed again. And it's a piece of parchment that is either washed, because parchment is made from animal skin, so it's more or less waterproof. You can wash it or scrape it to get the ink off of it, and then write a new text over it. And depending on the conditions it's stored in, sometimes the what's called the undertext, the original text that was written on a piece of parchment, can still be visible. And if you're lucky and a palimpsest has survived, then you can carefully separate the undertext from the overtext, so the new text that was written on this quote unquote blank parchment. Um, and if you can separate the two texts and identify them, you can see um, often texts that are 100 years or more older than the overtext that would otherwise not have been preserved. So, for example, in the book, one of the most famous Geniza manuscripts is a fragment of the Hexapla. So, the Hexapla was a 6-column translation of the Bible by where Origen collected, Church Father Origen, he collected 6 different translations from the sort of ancient Greek Bible translation traditions, as well as the Hebrew, and put them all into one manuscript. And all the copies of the hexapla before like the 10th century have been lost, except for this one Geniza fragment, which has like 2.5 columns from the I think the Book of Psalms from Origen's hexapla that was written in the 7th century. Then it was erased, scraped clean, washed clean, um, and then sold, we think, or distributed as waste paper material, like these other manuscripts I've talked about. And it ended up in a Jewish community, and a Jewish scribe then used this to write poetry by the Hebrew poet Yanai, who's a very famous late antique Hebrew poet. Um, so you have all these poems by Yanai. Actually, if you have the PDF, it's in the first chapter. You can even look at it. I can even tell you what page it's on. But so we think that this palimpsest, yeah, it's on page 4. We think that this palimpsest originally was written by Christian monks, probably in Palestine, at a monastery. And then monks kept using Greek for a long time, into the late antique and medieval period. Then those monks, for whatever reason, disposed of this book or sold it, and the pages of it were separated and ended up in the Jewish community. So actually, on pages 4 and 5 in the book here, there's 3 examples of palimpsests, and they're all from the same book of Hebrew poetry. So they all contain the text of poetry by Yanai, but the undertexts are all different translations of the Bible. So it seems that these may have come from multiple books in a monastery somewhere, and then a single Jewish scribe put them together as material for copying down this Hebrew poetry.
What are the methods or techniques used to discern? So, like, what kind of methods or techniques are used on the image, and do they grant? How do you get better fidelity than just the naked eye?
Yes, so there's a technique called multispectral imaging, MSI, where you can photograph a manuscript using more than just the visible spectrum of light. Usually, infrared is what's used, I think, to get try and get a contrast between the remaining ink, however much there is, from the undertext, and then the ink of the overtext, which presumably is a different type of ink slightly. Um, and it can using once you've done that and you can detect differences between the under and over text, you can, as we've done in the book here, highlight them in different colors. I don't know the technical wizardry exactly that allows our imaging team at the university library to do this. But you can see in the dark blue, that's all of the undertext, and then the light blue is the Hebrew text. So it's been separated out, and it is at this point easy enough to read if you know Hebrew or you know Greek.
It is discernible as like a distinct text, so I can't read it, but I can see it. Then, like, draw out to the side for listeners' benefit that the circle showing you from the text or from the document itself, and then they've kind of modified the coloration. So I forget the term, but it'll a little rolled up piece of parchment that gets fused over time. And I didn't come across anything about it in this book. Maybe I missed it, but I forget what the term for those is. But they're able to penetrate that now and discern text from that. Is that something you work with?
I don't, but it's something that I have read about. I'm sure you've heard about recently from, I think, Herculaneum, um, which is one of the cities that was destroyed when Mount Vesuvius erupted. Pompeii is more famous, but Herculaneum has these scrolls that were damaged in the fire and just fused up completely together. So there's no way that they can ever be unrolled, but using different imaging technology. So not just MSI, which is what we used for these palimpsests, but there's other technologies now that are able to sort of X-ray and see what the text on the interior of the scroll looks like. And you can imagine this is extremely expensive and labor intensive, but it can identify text that would otherwise be lost because if you tried to unroll them, they would just disintegrate.
I think just the idea, and I understand this is not the interview to go down this rabbit hole, but I'm still at least I'm gonna at least scratch that itch a little bit. So for listeners, like we're seeing with our eye, and that's considered electro-optical imaging. You can take a picture with a camera. That's EO, and then I'm taking that you're saying there's certain imaging, a different level of emissivity with the infrared in the old or scraped away text on these documents on this parchment that can be highlighted probably with some kind of algorithm that having some college doesn't allow me to understand. Like that's really cool.
I also don't understand it. This is the sort of thing where there's so much collaboration in these projects between the people who take the pictures, the people who process the images, the people who do the cataloging. That's mainly me, and then so yeah.
Yeah, I'm not trying to divert attention away because cataloging and archiving are essential for historical understanding and just the proper care of these things, which I think it's an interesting segue. I'll make this promise. I will find a different kind of nerd. You and I are unique kinds of nerds. I'm a nerd with not a lot of education who wants to learn, so I bother nerds like you who have this specialty, but you benefit from a whole different kind of nerd who could do and understand and facilitate this level of understanding neither of us is capable of, but we do benefit from.
It's okay.
Okay, I'll stop calling people my names, myself included, at least for a while. One of the charges that's made as they're going in to get these documents out is that they've not been properly maintained. But that seems like an accusation from someone who wants to archive and catalog things, and that was not the intent of this repository, correct? So it's two different motivations. So your motivation and your predecessor's motivations are different. What are your motivations as they apply to these documents?
Well, if I could just get one clarifying question. When you say my predecessors, do you mean the Jewish community that stored the manuscripts in their Geniza in the first place, or the people who brought them to Cambridge and then worked on them for the last 120 years?
The people who brought them to Cambridge. Yeah.
So my motivation with these manuscripts is to discover is not quite the right word because they've all obviously been discovered. Like we know where they are, but there are so many fragments of texts in the Cairo Genizah, 300,000 or more around the world, that many tens of thousands of them have never been read, at least not since they were originally written and disposed of. So modern researchers from a lot of different disciplines come to the Geniza looking for documents that may relate to economic history, social history, political history, whatever they're interested in. For the last 120 years, it's been mainly people interested in the medieval history of Judaism. Um, but more recently, it has included scholars who are interested in the history of the Arabic language. That's part of what I do, and also Islamic documents from the Fatimid and Mamluk caliphates that ended up in the Geniza, and what looks to be in the future studying scientific texts, many of which were written by Christian authors that ended up in the Geniza. Um, so my motivation is to find these things that for the most part haven't been read or haven't been looked at as valuable evidence by other scholars, um, and try and make it more accessible to more people. So there's two sides to that. One is trying to make it accessible to my professional colleagues. So I look at a lot of Jewish Arabic texts and try to show how they can be useful to people who mainly study Muslim Arabic, and see the similarities or differences and the way that we can use Jewish Arabic manuscripts to better understand the history of the Arabic language. The other side, of course, is trying to make the whole collection as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, which is why we are trying to, well, all the fragments have now been digitized, and we are trying to catalog them all so we can put them up on the Cambridge University Library's website. Right now, we have about 25,000 that are up there, and anyone can search for them and know what they are and then use them for their own research or for just learning, their own curiosity, and they can explore the collection on their own. And then in an ideal world, once all of that's done, my job isn't really needed. because anyone then has access to do the research themselves.
That's kind of sad to say your job's not needed after that point. I don't know. Now I feel like I have to come up with things for you to do.
So the job of a cataloger, right? As someone who does, this is not the only thing I do, of course, but the job of a cataloger is to finish the catalog and make it so everyone else um, can do research with material that otherwise they wouldn't be able to find. And one of the things with the digital catalog that we have now is that as people make new discoveries, we can update the catalog over time. It's not just one printed book anymore. So that's really valuable. Having all the Geniza manuscripts in the world now digitized, there's a project called the Friedberg Geniza Project that has all the manuscripts, images from all the collections in the world, and users, some professional scholars, academics, and others that aren't necessarily working for universities, can add notes and identify things, and then we can pool all of our knowledge together to identify stuff. So the job of a cataloger, once the catalog is done, it changes a bit. And I would also consider myself a historian. So I'm looking for things that are useful for my own historical research when I'm cataloging.
So I think it might be helpful here to juxtapose. I guess in some ways, some of these documents that are found that were in these repositories found may not be a great way to put it. But in this collection of collections, there are documents that were intended as history, but then you're going through, and I guess there is some kind of you and others are initiating historiography from a lot of these things. Is that fair to say?
Yes. So that would be like by identifying a text, even just taking a fragment that hasn't been cataloged before, no one has figured out what it is, and then I can say, well, this is actually from the 10th century. It was written by a Jewish scribe, and it is a translation of the Bible. It's this book, and that starts a record for that fragment. And now further scholarship can develop from that because now they know, okay, if we're looking for Arabic Bible fragments, here's another one. It's another data point, and we can build on it from there. And if once you see enough fragments, you start to see trends, and you can link them together, and that becomes wider historical trends, and that can be evidence for things very far from the Geniza. So, like trade routes around the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, we know about it mainly because of all of the traders who stopped in Cairo and wrote letters about it and what they brought, and like custom taxes that they paid, what they were selling things for, what they bought, and how much it cost them. Um, and a lot of them are just complaining. They're like, yeah, I brought 10 kilograms of pepper to Cairo, and no one wanted any, so I have to go to a new port.
And so what we learned from those letters is that they're in Cairo, where they came from, where they were intending to go, that kind of thing, right?
Yep. There's one letter that I really like that's in the book, and it's a Jewish mother is writing to her son who lives in a different city, and the whole thing is about how hard her journey, I think, to Alexandria or to Cairo was, and she's like, "Oh yeah, we almost drowned on the Nile, and then I got sick, and but the end was good, and we stayed with my friend, and she was, and then at the end, of course, is she gives a bunch of unsolicited advice."
I love how banal it is. I think it was Amanda Podney's book. I think it was Weaver's Scribes and Kings. I may be getting the order wrong there. But it's something like it's the history of the ancient Near East. And she starts out by basically talking about this trove of documents that they found that to me sounded like Yelp reviews for this one merchant. And just look at what a terrible job he was doing. It's kind of encouraging that people really haven't changed that much. And, and reading their letters at a time where people were not communicating as prolifically as we are now, but we're probably doing roughly the same kinds of things. Traffic was so bad. Yeah.
Yep. Yes, people are people, and we've always been people.
Yeah, it's just more immediate now. People are people and we're not that special. So I was wondering, and I think I did add this in the questions, and maybe the terminology is off here, but what is the spectrum of types of media that you see? So you mentioned papyrus, there's paper, or well, didn't no, sorry, you didn't mention papyrus. Yeah, maybe media is not the right way to put that.
Media would be like it's all written media. So for the most part, that's what but the material that each of the fragments is made of, each of the manuscripts is made of. In technical terms, that's also sometimes called the support for the manuscript, which can be paper, papyrus, parchment. There's other ones. Leather and fabric are possibilities. The main ones in the Cairo Genizah collections are paper and parchment. And medieval parchment was made by taking the skin of an animal and drying it and stretching it out. And you can imagine it was very expensive to make parchment because you had to kill animals for it. So there are some books like that more complete books, people try to estimate like how much it would have cost, like how many sheep would have been needed to create a really nice Quran manuscript, for example, or a really nice Bible, and it's like dozens of sheep that would have been needed just to make the parchment for one book. Um, so that's parchment, and then in the 10th century, paper spreads from farther east, starts out in China and through Central Asia, and eventually gets to Egypt around the 10th century. And it's rag paper at the time, so that's paper that is made by crushing up old clothes and rags and linen and stuff until it's just really fine fibers, and then you make a soup out of those fibers, and then you strain the soup with a big sieve in a rectangular wooden square, and then when that dries, it turns into paper. Um, so that was a much cheaper process than making parchment because you could recycle old clothes and rags that were being recycled all the time anyway, um, and you could even recycle used paper into more paper. So with the spread of paper to Egypt around the 10th century, we see like to some extent an increase in the writing of like less prestigious manuscripts. That's not to say there weren't things before, because of course papyrus was big in Egypt. That was the main writing material up until about the 10th century. Papyrus is made from the reeds of the papyrus plant, which grows natively along the Nile. Um, and that's actually where we get the word from paper, because paper resembles papyrus, and it became referred to by the same word. Um, so the Geniza does not have a lot of papyrus in it. There's only one papyrus manuscript that we know of in Cambridge, and it's an 8th century Hebrew book of liturgical poems. Everything else is paper or parchment, and the parchment, for the most part, declines in use as paper becomes more popular and cheaper. Around the 10th, 11th century, we see a decline in parchment, and by the end of the Geniza period, everything is paper.
How about the inks? Or I don't even mean to. I don't know to say pencil, but what kind of things were they using to put words on the sheet of paper or papyrus?
Right. So there's basically three main types of inks. Um, the One of them is what's called an iron gall or metallogallic ink, and that's made from using metallic compounds, usually containing iron, and I think it's an acid from what's called a gall nut, which is a growth on an oak tree that grows around the larva of a particular species of wasp. And then you can take these nuts and turn them into some compound that helps to make ink. And iron gall ink is really useful for writing on parchment because it like really penetrates the surface well, and it tends to fade over time but not scrape off very much. Um, the other cheaper option for ink is carbon-based ink, which is basically made from charcoal or soot that you could get from a fire. And there's a bunch of recipes for charcoal inks that we find in the medieval period. And these would have been cheaper to make, and they don't penetrate parchment as well. They do a bit for paper, but compared to iron gall inks, they tend to flake off over time, and it's much easier to rub them off if the manuscript or the book was damaged. Um, there's also a less common type, which is made with like natural dyes from plants and stuff. I don't know a lot about that particular type of ink, but there is a book that came out a couple of years ago by Zena Cohen, and she wrote it specifically about inks and writing material in the Cairo Genizah documents. The exact title of her book is, I think it's like writing, like inks and writing composition materials in the Cairo Genizah. Um, okay, yeah, Zena Cohen. Um, so that would be a good book to check out because I know a lot about paper. I don't know as much about ink.
Fair enough. I just realized as we're talking, I've never even thought about that. One time I heard someone telling a story. He was teaching a Greek class, and one of his students had been, I think it was Kenneth Bailey. One of his students had been a monk, and he would copy texts. And he was telling them sometimes flies land on the ink, and some of these tinier dots and things. They'll drink them off, and it changes what the word or the sentence means. But I've never actually done any investigation into how they put words on paper.
Yeah, one of the things we get with Geniza fragments is you'll get a lot of dirt and sometimes just like fly excrement that ends up on a page, and you can't always tell if that's supposed to be ink or if it's supposed to be the word. But of course, we have excellent conservators who, over the last several decades now, have cleaned and properly conserved every Geniza fragment in Cambridge, so they're safe and for the most part legible.
Man, that's got to be really frustrating. Right. So I know we need to start to transition into ending this. What methods do you use to date these documents to figure out when they were created originally?
Right. So, in an ideal world, if you get lucky, a manuscript just has the date it was written on it. So, yeah, official court documents, for example, either from the rabbinic court in Cairo or from the Muslim government in Cairo in the medieval period, will often just say the date. You know, this was written on the 12th of Cheshvan in year whatever, and then the year will be given in one of several different calendars. They weren't using the AD CE calendar that we use now. The Jewish documents are often dated according to the date that is calculated from creation in the Bible, which is around 5,500 years ago in that calendar. And then the other calendar that Jews tend to use in the medieval period is the date in what's called the era of documents, or in the reckoning of the Greeks, as the Christians call it. And that is from the beginning of I think, the Seleucid dynasty in 311 BCE. So they calculate from that as the start of the calendar. And then Muslim documents that are dated have the Hijri calendar, which is calculated from the year that Muhammad made his migration from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE. So the dates will be given based on one of those calendars usually. The harder question, of course, is what do we do with a document that doesn't have a date on it? And we have a couple techniques for estimating, but it's very difficult to be precise. One of the techniques is called paleography, which is the examination of handwriting to detect trends and changes over time in the styles of handwriting. So you can tell pretty easily if a manuscript was written around the 10th century in Hebrew or the 19th century in Hebrew, because the style of writing Hebrew letters changes so much. But it gets more complicated because you can't always tell changes in style between the 9th and 10th century or between the 10th and 11th century. So there's a lot of estimation that goes on in paleography. Similar analysis can be done with linguistics. So you can see certain words or certain forms of Arabic or Hebrew that only arise in certain periods. If you can detect that in a text that you're reading, you know at least it can't be earlier than a certain date or it can't be later than a certain date. And also bookbinding practices change over time. So a lot of books from the early period of the Geniza are horizontal format, so like a landscape format if you were printing it out. But then around the 10th, 11th, yeah, 9th or 10th century, there's a shift in Egypt where it becomes more common to write it in portrait format, so vertical format, we'd say. So that can also help. But all of these different trends depend on where the person making the thing learned to make it. Because if they're coming from Morocco or if they're coming from Iran, there were different traditions there. So it's not nothing is ironclad.
Okay, that's really cool. And I know you don't have enough time for me to keep asking you questions about that, so I'll transition into buy this book because there's a lot in there. I mean, I'm looking at 340 pages in this document, and there are so many different things you can go through. There's so much you can learn about how people learn these things. For sure, get this book. But in addition to that, to learn more about what you do and what others who do similar work do, where would you direct people? And that could be books or YouTube or podcasts or whatever.
Right. Well, two things. I got one book that I would recommend. There's a lot of books, but one for sure is called Sacred Trash, and it is by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole. Came out in about 2011. But Sacred Trash is about the story of the discovery of the Cairo Genizah by Western scholars, and all of the characters and the intrigue and machinations between Cambridge and Oxford that occurred as people were trying to first figure out where what had been considered lost to the ages texts were coming from, because all of a sudden in the 1890s, fragments of books that were thought to be completely lost started turning up on the antiquities market, and Cambridge and Oxford scholars started thinking, well, where are these coming from? We have to go to Egypt and figure this out. And that led to most of the Cairo Genizah eventually coming to Cambridge. So Sacred Trash is about that, and then the conservation and storage of all the manuscripts in Cambridge over time up to the creation of the Geniza Research Unit in the 1970s, and that's what I work for. So that's Sacred Trash by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole. Second recommendation would be to go to the Geniza Research Unit's website, which you can just Google Geniza Research Unit and it should come up. And we have a bunch of links to articles and newsletters that we've written, including we have a monthly series called the Fragment of the Month, where we highlight a specific Geniza fragment and write up stuff about it. Actually, I just wrote one that's going to be coming out for August of this year. And we tell a little story about how we interpret that manuscript and where it is in the wider story of the Geniza. And there's also opportunities to book guided tours of the Geniza collection in Cambridge. If you happen to live in the UK, you can do all of that from our website.
Okay, yeah, those are great. And I'll have that link. That was the thing that came up reading the introduction to the book for sure. So they're just trying to get all these things digitized, and I think that's really cool. I want to throw one out there, though. I didn't realize I had been exposed to the story of the Cairo Genizah. I think I just kind of brain dumped it, which I tend to do a lot. I think the book is called Discovering Second Temple Literature by Malka Simkovich. This story comes up in there about the Cairo Genizah, and I knew it rung a bell, so I had to check my Kindle app on my desktop here as I was getting prepared. But moving into what do you read for fun? This is where I like to end things. What do you read for fun?
I recently, this is going to sound pretty nerdy. I recently read a book called the Sisters of Sinai for fun, and it is about two Semitic philologists who lived in Cambridge in the 1890s, named Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson, who were twin sisters, Scottish, and like irresponsibly wealthy, basically. And they came to Cambridge and were just incredible scholars in Arabic and Hebrew and Syriac, which is something I also study. And Sisters of Sinai is about really how remarkable their lives are as Victorian women who are largely self-taught in all the languages of the Middle East, and they could speak Greek, and they would go and visit monasteries and hang out with the Greek monks and convince them to show them their oldest, most valuable manuscripts. And from that, they became quite famous, and yet were repeatedly snubbed by the wider culture in Cambridge. So that is something that was a little bit personal to me, being spending so much time in Cambridge, and it's just a really interesting story about two women in academia a long time before that was anything normal.
They're part of the story as well, if I'm not mistaken.
They are. They have a smaller role to play in the Geniza story, but yes, they did bring one of the original manuscripts that was originally thought to be lost to time to Cambridge, and that set off Solomon Schechter on his adventure to find the Geniza in Cairo.
So is that I'm guessing that's nonfiction, that book?
It is. It's by Janet Soskis. It's a biography, but it is nonfiction, and it tells the story of their travels around Egypt to different monasteries, St. Catherine's Monastery in particular. They're just really interesting characters.
You're not the first person to give an answer that is roughly, I read this thing for fun that's in my area of specialty. It's pretty nerdy. I feel like you scholars uh, don't talk to each other because enough of you have answered that question to me of like, I know it's not cool, but I really like ancient Greek texts.
Yeah, well, we do talk to each other. Part of it is always, you spend so much time reading like academic articles and academic books, and every once in a while they'll refer you to something that is more sort of pop history, and then you think, huh, that's related to something I already know I'm interested in. And that's sort of what Sisters of Sinai is. Sacred Trash is actually similar in that respect. It's not written for academics; it's written for a wider audience.
Well, and if the answer is no, that's fine. But is there something non work related that you do to decompress? And it doesn't have to be reading.
Um, Yeah, I like to play chess a lot. Got the chess.com app. So been playing chess since I was like 10 years old in chess clubs and stuff. So I like to do that. And I'll go for a run. I actually just moved to Germany, and I've been running around the city to sort of learn where I live because I don't speak German. It's the easiest way for me to get a sense of my surroundings.
That's fair. My son, who's 17 now, but when he was 4, had learned how to play chess, and he wanted me to learn how to play chess with him. So I learned to play chess, and then I went to this party at a friend's house when he had graduated from an engineering program at Rice University, uh, and one of his engineer friends wanted to play chess, and he was like, um, he was just trouncing me, and he was like, "Do you want to keep playing?" I was like, "Yeah, I don't care. I learned to play with a 4-year-old, man. I don't expect to be good. I'm okay losing." So that is as far as I'm concerned with chess is getting beaten by adults and probably a 4-year-old. Great recommendations, and hey, if it's fun to you, it's fun to you. I'll try to get that linked in the notes. So unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Okay, no, thanks a lot for having me on. Thanks for all the good questions. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for hanging out after the actual episode is over. Now, here's a quick preview of next week's guest, John Anthony Dunn. We'll be discussing his Journal of Biblical Literature article, The Souring of the Ways, Anti-Jewish Readings of Psalm 69, and the Wine Offerings to Jesus. John is also one of the hosts of the Two Cities podcast. I'll have a link to their website out there, but for sure check that out. Give him some support. I'm sure more support will come my way from listeners to their podcast than the other direction, but I still want to encourage that.
So in the four Gospels, all four Gospels have an offering of ox sauce or sour wine / vinegar while Jesus is on the cross. All four Gospels have that. But Matthew and Mark also have a mixed wine, oinos, given to Jesus just before he's crucified, on his way with the cross, etc. And those mixed wines in Matthew and Mark are also not exactly the same thing. Mark has myrrh and Matthew has gall. Now, the sour wines that I mentioned don't have anything mixed with them. But what has happened in the reception of these texts is that everything gets simplified after a little bit of time of trying to kind of figure out, are we dealing with multiple events, or are we dealing with, obviously we're dealing with two in the case of Matthew and Mark, but do Luke and John further complicate things where maybe Luke and John's versions aren't the same as Matthew and Mark's second versions because there are differences in details, not least who is potentially giving the sour wine to Jesus, what their motivations were, etc. So it gets complicated and the details are like quite messy. So the natural thing to do is to simplify. And that is really what the tradition ends up doing. And so my piece is really just trying to argue what sort of, what's the driving force behind that simplification? Is it strictly a matter of the details are confusing, or there's something else going on? And so my argument is that there is something else going on, and that we can see evidence of an intertext, Psalm 69, really controlling the details of that simplification.